Hi everyone, welcome to Mathys Squire's webinar on practical IP matters, presented by our very own patent attorneys, Sean Leach and Andrew White. My name is Saba Ismail and I'll be the host for this webinar. We hope you enjoy.
It's important to say, though, that although we're patent attorneys, there is more to life than patents. Patents, Andy looks incredulous, but I tell you it's true. Patents really aren't what we do. Very often they're how we do what we do. But the point is, what we really do is provide commercial tools for business. And that means taking a holistic view and putting things in their broader commercial and practical context. And that really is what we're about, and it's the purpose of this session. So getting the best out of IP really means understanding that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Really, it exists at the interface between technology and the commercial and practical requirements of a business. And understanding that interplay really enables you to leverage it in the best way possible. And what I mean by that is that in any commercial trajectory, in any relationship, there are generally pinch points, turning points, if you like, at which matters can take a different direction. It might be the point at which you conclude a license. It might be the point at which you launch a new product. It might be the point at which you simply maintain an existing contract. And understanding how the IP works and positioning it correctly, getting your strategy right, really means getting the most leverage out of your IP at those turning points.
Thanks, Sean. So exactly, I think one of the key messages we want to get across in today's webinar is the importance of developing an IP strategy early on. Now, when developing an IP strategy, really first and foremost, you need to think about what the objectives are. What do you want to achieve from that IP strategy? And that should really align very closely with the commercial objectives of the business. We've listed some common threads that we've seen ourselves when working with clients over the years of some of the key objectives they want to achieve. That could be things ranging from maintaining supply agreements to creating new revenue streams through licensing to purely being able to sell products that you've made and developed yourselves with other partners, or quantifying IP risks for providing warranties and perhaps statements that you don't infringe third-party IP. So these are some of the common reasons we see for some of the common objectives for developing an IP strategy. Now, to put things into a bit more context and so they make a bit more sense to you, we're going to run through 5 anonymized case studies today that give you more of a concrete example so you can actually see what we mean rather than just describe things in sort of nebulous and perhaps abstract terms. So in reality, when developing an IP strategy, it's an exercise in risk management. Now, many of you who are running your own business might think, well, actually, am I actively making IP risk decisions all the time? Well, actually, yes, most businesses are one way or another, whether it's actively or passively. Now, passively, that could just be a decision of actually, we just don't want to think about this or we don't want to file any patents. So to give you an example, there's a client Sean and I have been working with for many years, bright guy. They had a great business based in the UK, and everything they did was sort of an incremental development or something they'd done before. And so to his sort of engineering eyes, he thought, well, actually, there's nothing that special there. It's just an incremental development on what we've done before. So he thought, well, actually, it's probably not going to get a patent for that. What's the worth in it? Let's just not file. So he was making a sort of a decision there not to file IP rights. So there was an IP risk decision that was being made. Now, on the other hand, he was also looking at his competitor based in the US, and we're seeing that they kept getting patents granted to things that, in his eyes, were seemingly obvious. Now, that made him concerned, and it also made him wary about entering that market and doing things that would infringe those IP rights. So there was actually an asymmetry there in his sort of perception of risk there. On the one hand, he thought, well, there wasn't much value in these IP rights for himself, but on the other hand, the third party's IP rights were making him wary about what they were going to do as a business. So we effectively highlighted this sort of asymmetry in his perception to it.
Very diplomatically.
Of course. And we persuaded him to say, look, how about you just let us file a few patents on the next products that you're developing? So we went away and did that, got some patents filed, and over the course of time they were granted, and they sort of trundled along, and he didn't really hear much back. A few more years passed on, and actually his company and the competitor in the US, they became part of the same parent company. So the two directors of both companies sat down and went through their IP portfolios, as you sensibly should do, to consider whether there was any consolidation that could be performed. And what was really interesting was that the US director said to the guy we had been working with, the UK company, whatever you do, don't drop these 3 patents. They're, importantly, what stopped us coming after you and stopped us coming into your market. And of course, the guy we had been working with, he had never heard any of that. He didn't know what effect at all those IP rights had had. So I think the simple message here is really, you may never know the effect your IP rights have. And that could be quite a good thing. Extremely powerful, even if you don't hear anything yourself actively about them.
That's a great story, a great example. One of the reasons I like it, in fact, there's a couple of reasons I like it. The main reason I like it is that it's a really uncommon insight. The number of times in my career you've known what the other guy was thinking when he looked at your portfolio and was making a decision as to what your portfolio meant for him. I mean, I can count them on the fingers of one hand. That's the only occasion it's ever happened. The other reason I like that story is because it illustrates 2 really key points. First, it's easy to lose valuable IP by not thinking actively about it. And had Bill not got annoyed and let us file those cases, he would have lost that IP. And the valuable IP wasn't where he thought it was, which is why I also like the example I've got on screen now. So the thing that's illustrated here is a central heating pump. They're ubiquitous. They're probably in most houses in the country. And they've got bags of IP in them. If you look at this thing, where do you think the most valuable IP is? Do you think it's in, I don't know, the motor that runs it? Do you think it's in the electronics? Maybe in the firmware that controls the pump? Maybe it's in the very sensitive and careful design of the impeller. Could be in any of those things. No doubt there are patents covering all of them. In fact, there are. I've investigated it. But the most important IP here isn't in those things. It's in the box. And when I say it's in the box, what I really mean is it's the box, that black box on top. Because it turns out that when you need to install a central heating pump, you need to reach into the back of somebody's closet, you need to get into the dusty space under their stairs, you need to work between 2 struts under the floorboards where the heating pipes are, and it's inaccessible and it's dark and it's difficult to reach. Now, that box is set up so you can route the power cable in from any one of the 4 sides. And it's also set up so that irrespective of the direction you take the power cable in, the panel on the front can be rotated. The control panel on the front can be rotated any orientation you like. And what that means is it's easy to install and it's easy to program. So having looked at this technology, actually it turns out that the thing which is apparently most simple is most important to the person who uses it, because the guy who installs this thing, the heating engineer, really, he's your end customer. He's the person who decides which pumps get bought. And if there is an alternative pump which takes him 10 minutes longer, if you're fitting 15 of these things in a day, that's a significant disadvantage. Which leads neatly to, sorry Andy, can I have the next slide? Which leads neatly to this, which is a well-established and very scientific inverse relationship between commercial value and inventive step and cleverness, really, because the value in a patent isn't actually in how complex it is. It isn't actually in how clever it is. The value is driven by the market. So if you think about it, the things which are most valuable are those for which there is an active market, not the things which are cleverest. So imagine the left-hand end of this curve, putting a capacitive touchscreen on a mobile phone, hugely valuable. IP rights there, worth a fortune. At the right-hand end of this curve, an enabling technology for quantum computing, incredibly impressive, really important, but currently, how big's the market? It's minuscule. It's not of huge value. So what I hope you'll get from the last example and from this cartoon graph is that when you're considering the value in IP and making decisions as to what IP is worth protecting, it's the commercial considerations that should drive those decisions.
And I mean, of course, the quantum computing, it could be massively valuable in years to come, but a patent can only last for 20 years, right? So, you know, it's almost too far ahead of its time if you were to patent it now.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, so we've got a couple of ideas now. We've got the idea that IP can leak, and the valuable IP might not be the stuff that immediately strikes you as being clever. I want to talk now about the idea that your IP might be working for you while you're asleep and you may never even know about it, and also about the need to control risk in a supply chain. Let's take a hypothetical example, a relationship between a manufacturer of mousetraps. These mousetraps are enormously popular, they're very widely used, and they have a distributor who has great relationships with all of the businesses up and down the country that use these mousetraps. One day, the manufacturer decides he's going to increase his prices by 20%, based on a real-life example. This is based on a real-life example. It wasn't mousetraps, but let's pretend for the time being that it was. Manufacturer decides he's going to increase his prices by 20%. Distributor says this is an outrage. Phones his mate in China and says, I need a manufacturer of mousetraps, please. Here's a product specification, make me one of these. Sure enough, excellent Chinese manufacturer, very capable, goes away, makes perfect version of this mousetrap, performs exactly as it should. Legal department in the distributor phone us up and say, just checking before we launch this thing, there's no IP that's going to stop us using this product, is there? So we go away and we look. Turns out the manufacturer of the mousetrap has patents which cover the balance of the tension in the winding of the spring, the material that's used for the base of the board, the shape of the trigger arm, the manner in which the cheese is cut. I mean, I'm using a cartoon example to honestly to protect the innocent, but the point is that in a mature technology, incremental development can be protected, and where there is pressure on consumer acceptability, those things create real risk, because at the point the distributor, in this case our client, was asking us, well, can we supply this Chinese alternative product? The clear answer was, well, you can, because probably we can design around these 3 or 4 patents, and that one there is probably of questionable validity. But in the final analysis, all of these things are risk judgments. And if one or other of them is wrong, there is the potential for enormous reputational damage, enormous financial cost, and not just that, the relationship with your customers. You're going to have to go to all of the businesses which have your mousetraps installed and rip them out and pay the cost of putting in new ones. So, okay, we can give you a long and complicated piece of legal advice about this, which might or might not cover you, but the commercial risk remains the same. And so the upshot of that was that the distributor couldn't use his Chinese substitute product. The manufacturer sat there quietly, never knew his patent portfolio had done anything for him, carried on, put his prices up, increased his profit margin. Everybody went away happy. Well, most people.
Very powerful, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I've got a quick case study now. So I think it's our 4th of 5, just to give you an idea of where we're at. It's a very simple case study, but it's got a very powerful message, and so that's why we wanted to include it today. So we've been working with a small startup, a couple of guys working in the electric vehicle sector. Things were going well, but obviously being a startup, they couldn't do everything themselves, so had to engage other parties to help design and develop various aspects of the product they were trying to offer. Now, to move things to the next level, they thought, great, let's raise some money on a crowdfunding platform, as many sort of startups and early stage businesses do. Things went really well, actually, and they were massively overfunding. So they sort of, were rubbing their hands thinking, great, we can actually get things going here. Quite close to the deadline for the fundraising round to close, the platform sort of goes back to the company and says, before we can release the funds, you do know you have to provide us evidence that all of the IP rights that you say you own are actually yours. So the company, we've been working with them off and on for a bit, came to us and said, oh yeah, everything's fine, isn't it? And then we looked through things and worked out actually there was a design for something they were offering, and they had commissioned someone to do that design for them. Now that's important because the default position under UK law is that if you commission a contractor to do some work for you, the default is the contractor owns those IP rights. It's a bit like a wedding photographer. If you pay a wedding photographer, they own the rights, and you have to buy some photos off them. Similar thing here. So actually, it turned out they didn't own the IP rights in some of the designs. Now they were like, right, well, how do we fix it? We've got to get these rights assigned to us. Sadly, I think part of the problem here was that crowdfunding is public. It's very much in the public domain. So the designer could see, wow, they're massively overfunding, aren't they? And now they're coming to me cap in hand. A bit unscrupulous, but it meant, well, he saw the advantage there, and he thought, well, actually, it's the value of this has suddenly changed now because of the circumstances, and said, well, actually now because of the value here, you need to pay me more. It's worth more. And so simply they had to. Now, if only, and in hindsight, and I think they've learned their lesson now in this respect, but it's if only they had, when they had engaged that contractor, there had been an IP clause in there. It literally could be one little paragraph, couple of lines long, saying that the IP rights as part of this engagement belong to the person commissioning the work. That could have fixed things, and they could have had the work transferred to, they could have had the rights in it transferred to them for much less money than they did in the end. So it's a very powerful message in that simple things done early can save you a lot of time and effort and money.
So true. It's true over and over again all the time. Reaching agreement is easy when the value is low. As soon as there's money involved, people suddenly become much less amenable. Exactly.
And I think the other thing is it's easy to say in hindsight now, because why would the business necessarily have known that? But as IP professionals, it's our business to know this. So sort of really, if they had just consulted us about this issue beforehand, we could have helped them.
Yeah. And the differential in cost between a few lines in an agreement and the settlement they had to pay. So the next example we want to use is pretty much more of the same. It's a similar circumstance in some ways, and it relates to a piece of joint development work. Very often we see clients, technology businesses working together. It's more and more common because technology companies are often very specialized, and so they'll go to particular specialized suppliers for particular parts of a product. We were engaged in a project in which our client, an electronics company, had been asked by a consumer products company, let's call them that, consumer products company, to help them make a widget, a box with some electronics and some software in it. The customer in this case, the consumer products company, came to the client with a requirement specification. I want you to make something that looks a bit like this, needs to fit in this box, needs to meet these requirements essentially, and we need you to make the electronics and the software for it, and for it all to fit together in the box. so far so simple. They concluded an NDA between them, and they set about doing the work. And the work involved a whole load of different technology streams. There was the work in the electronics, how the chips were put together, even the layout of the circuit board. There's the confidential information and know-how in the hard engineering work of getting that thing to function. There could have been some patents. As it turns out, there weren't, which was a problem. And then, of course, in all modern electronics, really, there are computer programs as well. There's firmware, and in that firmware there is copyright and there's confidential information in the source code. And there could have been, but there weren't, patents. So that's the background. The next slide, please. Essentially, Company A, the electronics company, really had all the background IP. They had existing hardware and firmware from their earlier projects. They knew about how all the electronics went together. All of the hard technical stuff in here really belonged to the electronics company. What the consumer products company had, Company B, really was just requirements specification for a new widget. It wasn't amazingly complex, but it was confidential, and between the two of them, they had signed an NDA, so there was some obligation of confidence between the two of them. I think there was a purchase order, totally unsuitable for any IP transaction, just related really to a sale of goods, and no other IP agreement. And also, as is often the case, engineers working on a project together, emails going back and forth, meetings with no minutes kept, imperfect record keeping. Over time, the relationship degrades, and it turns out that our electronics company want to move on. They've got a lucrative new deal on the horizon, could make the company worth a fortune to them, and so what they want to do is take their electronics and know-how and move on and use it in a new project. But of course, they've got a problem, because there's an NDA in the background here, no agreement as to who owns what IP, and they owe obligations of confidence to the consumer products company. They don't know really which bits of their technology they're free to use and which they're not. Looking at the boot that's on the other foot, the consumer products company wants to be able to make and sell their widgets, but actually they can't necessarily, because to do so might amount to an improper disclosure of the electronics company's confidential information. For example, if they need to use the source code or adapt the source code for any future development of that thing. So both companies have a problem here. Neither of them can get on with their lives separately. In fact, they need something by way of a divorce agreement. And if you think about it, this Venn diagram kind of illustrates it. Each of the companies has some new IP that they've generated, and the background IP that the electronics company brought to the table to begin with is mixed up with that in some difficult and complicated way. And you've got a whole bundle of different IP rights which are relevant here: copyright, confidential information, potentially patents as well. There weren't any, it would have clarified everything. But the real point is there is uncertainty, because the boundaries between different types of IP here are very unclear. And so for the electronics company who want to move into their lucrative future relationship, they're not able to give a warranty to their future partner that says, yes, I own all of this IP and there's no infringement risk here, because they know that they owe some obligations of confidence to this other party, and they can't even define them because they don't know really which areas of the technology they relate to. So this might sound like a peculiar set of circumstances, but trust me, it is all too common for people to say, I've got an NDA, everything's fine. All I need now is the purchase order so I can start making and selling goods. Completely understandable. Business is about selling stuff, right? But what happens when the next deal comes along? Now, Andy and I, being patent attorneys, we don't really view the world through this lens. We have a slightly different lens through which we view the world, and it looks a bit more like this, right? Because in the way we see the world, we impose this particular structure on things. Okay, we look at a product, a mundane object, a central heating pump, if you like, and we say, okay, what are the constituent parts of this? Okay, there's a load of technology in the background. There's user manuals, there might be some software, there might be some electronics, but what are the IP rights which relate to each thing? And the reason it's important to see the world in this way is if you want to plan for the future, if you want to plan for your future commercial relationships, you need to understand what's happening to the property rights in each of those different strands of technology. And really, when we talk about developing an IP strategy, what we really mean is fixing your objectives, really, for each of those different types of IP and working out what you're going to do with each of them.
Exactly. So we've mentioned IP strategy quite a few times throughout this webinar, and it might seem a bit nebulous. You might be a bit confused as to, okay, I understand I need one, but what does it really mean? What does it look like? And at least as scientists ourselves, we sort of like to see an example of something so we know what's being meant. So we've mocked up this draft table here. It might seem quite simple, quite trite, but it just helps to illustrate the point that Sean was just making then. Really, what you want to do when developing an IP strategy, and this is something we would of course help you with if you wanted, is you want to split up and identify all of the different types of IP that might be relevant to your business and or your competitors and or who you're working with. So it could be any of the things that we've listed up there, from patents to supply agreements, to everything in between. And then once you've identified all those different types of IP rights, you then want to think about what are the risks there and what can be done to mitigate any risks. Now, it could be quite simple. It could, you could formulate this IP strategy at a very early stage and you might not know too much about where things are going. And so you might just have, as you can see there are sort of there's two rows. There's things that we've done already and things that we plan to action in the future. It could just be something that like, oh, we want to consider agreements in future. That's fine. And the reason that's helpful is it prevents you making those inadvertent passive decisions about IP risk without you don't want to, you might overlook something that you actually wish you had done. You don't want to be in that position where you are, crowdfunding and having to pay someone 10 times more than you should have done for something if only you had remembered to get that agreement in place beforehand. That might seem very simple, but sadly, Sean and I see it all the time with clients we work with. So it can be very simple. And the other reason we like this table is simplicity can also mean it doesn't have to cost a lot either. So something we see a lot as well is with smaller businesses, they might think, I don't have the budget yet to think about IP. It's not on my priority list, but it should be. And especially even more so in times like these when perhaps people have got a bit more time on their hands and more time to consider strategy and other things. It's just a case of really identifying risks and thinking what can be done about those risks. You don't necessarily have to spend a lot of money on that now. It's just planning so you don't make those mistakes later down the line that can be quite costly and much more harder to fix. So I hope that sort of just helps illustrate the point. We'll be very happy to take questions on this afterwards. So just to wrap up really our webinar today, we thought we'd finish off with some top tips and some key messages. So really the top tips here are driven by our experience of working with clients and things that we've seen as being issues when we've started working with them. But first and foremost, really your IP strategy should always be commercially focused. The goal is it should add value. It shouldn't be a drag. It shouldn't just be seen as a cost. Really, the purpose of an IP strategy is to add value to the business in the long run. Whether it's, you might think, oh, it's costing me now on this first deal that we've got, but actually when the next deal comes along, you've mitigated against that rather than having to spend all the money when you're starting the second supply deal. You've actually spent less money fixing it with the first deal, if that makes sense. Something else that I think many businesses overlook is their own background IP. I think it's the first example I gave there where the engineer was thinking that everything they did was obvious. Most people downplay their own IP and don't realize how much IP their business actually has. So always consider your background IP and what you as a company are bringing to the table, especially when you're working with a third party. They want to work with you for a reason. Sort of the corollary, the same sort of point really there is just don't overlook the seemingly simple inventions. With that, the graph that we had, the don't overlook the seemingly simple ones. They're often the most commercially valuable. And then something again we see time and time again that Sean illustrated in his example is a lot of people think, oh, we've got an NDA in place, that's it, we're covered for IP, really, aren't we? And sadly, not really. NDAs are great, they have their time and place, but they're very limited, and they're not a substitute for a proper IP agreement. So whilst, of course, it's great, when we hear people talk about NDAs, it's like, great, okay, at least they're thinking about IP, but it's not the be all and end all, and businesses should understand they have their limitations. And of course, when it comes to IP, and even more so in these times, budget is always an issue. So we thought we'd just flag some top tips to help keep your IP budget in check. And really, that's one of the key messages of today's webinar, is if you get your strategy in place from an early stage, it can help keep your IP budget in check. So one thing that you could always do is perform regular reviews. So it comes back to the point about the IP strategy being commercially relevant. Really, you should have perhaps quarterly, I don't know, whatever's appropriate for your business, have a review of your IP objectives, that IP strategy, and how that aligns with what as a business you're doing. Particularly at times like these, some businesses have changed direction slightly. Is their IP strategy still aligned with what they're doing? And a patent attorney can definitely help you with that. Another thing is people or businesses that we've worked with, they may have spent money developing an IP portfolio or getting a patent and think, oh, I've spent this much money on it already. I need to keep it because I've spent the money on it. Now, whilst there should be some value in those IP rights, if you've got them, and perhaps you might be able to license them, just because you spent some money on them doesn't mean you should continue to spend money on them. So sometimes, critical decisions should be made. Do we still need those IP rights?
You'd be surprised how reluctant people are to drop stuff.
Yeah. Something else we see, I think particularly more so with definitely the smaller end of sort of the business scale, very much the startup end, is people are very ambitious, which is fantastic. They'll come to us and say, we want a patent in every country in the world. And that's not really commercially, that doesn't make sense. And you can be much cleverer about it. Actually, if you carefully get patent protection in a few key markets, a few key territories, that can push the risk balance much more in your favor and make the third party think, well, if I can only operate in, one particular territory that's of a very small market, it's not worth my while, so I'm not going to go there. And then finally, I know I've said it again and again during today's session, but just don't leave it too late. Think about an IP strategy right from the beginning. Leaving it too late can be very costly to fix, and sometimes it might not even be possible. So.
Which leads directly into my next point. In fact, plan ahead. I think Andy summed it up perfectly. Do the simple things early. And as his example with the commissioned work show, agreement is easy when value is low. So by doing the things that are easy early on, you can build your position up over time. You do simple things little and often, and your position accumulates. As Andy says, put commercial value first. Identify the risks as you go, but think not only about the risks that you face yourself, think about how those risks affect your own decision making, and try to position your own IP so it drives other people's decision making in the same way. And of course, create a strategy. Do as Andy said, identify each different type of IP. What's the objective for this? What are the risks? What are the mitigations? What's the process we're going to put in place for each type of IP in order for us to reach our objectives? So I think probably we should draw a line under it there. I think that's a sensible place to stop.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sean and Andrew, for the presentation. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank everyone that joined us online. We hope that you found this useful. I would like to mention that you will be redirected to a feedback form as soon as this webinar is over. We'd really love to hear your thoughts about what you thought about the webinar today, as well as any topics you'd like us to cover in the future. So that'd be great. And as you can see just from the slide, you see Sean and Andy's email addresses. Please feel free to email them directly to discuss any follow-up questions that you may have. And yeah, I think just finally to say thank you and take care. Hope to see you at a future webinar. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Bye.